Margaret Doyle set the fire, not knowing it would open a door that had been sealed for 60 years. And by the time she understood what she had found beneath the ash, she would never look at her grandmother's silence the same way again. She had not been looking for anything that October morning. She had been looking at 4 acres of hillside behind the old byre that had not grown a blade of usable grass since the 1960s, choked instead with gorse and bramble and stunted hawthorn so dense a person could not push 10 feet into it without shears. Margaret had come back to the farm in County Clare after her Aunt Bridget passed in the spring, and she understood enough about the price of winter fodder to know that reclaimed ground was worth the trouble of clearing it. 41 years old, widowed the previous winter, she had nothing left in Dublin worth staying for, and everything here that still needed tending. The farm had been in the family for 4 generations, and she had spent every summer of her childhood on it. And still she had never once climbed that particular slope, because there had never been a reason to. She ran the burn on a still Saturday when the wind sat low and steady from the west. The fire break she had scraped along the top, wide enough to hold it back from the pasture above. The gorse went up fast and hot, cracking as it caught, and by evening the slope was black and smoking in patches, the air thick with the smell of scorched earth. She came out the next morning before the frost had lifted, walking the upper section where the burn had taken cleanest, looking at how much root work remained before the ground was worth reseeding. Her boots left prints in the ash. She was not looking for stone. She saw the edge of one anyway. A flat gray slab set at an angle limestone did not naturally take on that hillside. She scraped the ash away with her boot, then knelt and brushed at it with her bare hand, not caring about the soot. The stone was cut square on 3 sides, 4 inches thick, the 4th side buried under a hawthorn stump that had not fully burned. She pulled the stump aside and found a second slab behind it, sat back and dropping lower into the slope. Then a third, a fourth. Her heart was going faster than the work should have called for. Her neighbor, Sean Culligan, drove up to see how the burn had gone, and found her on her knees in the ash, hands black to the wrist. He looked down at what she'd uncovered and said, "Those aren't natural." She said no. He crouched beside her and ran a thumb along the cut edge of the stone, quiet for a moment, and then asked where they went. She looked down toward the unburned brush further along the slope and said she'd never known they were there in 41 years of visiting this farm as a child. "Neither of us did," he said. "That's the strange part." She spent the following week clearing the steps by hand, a garden trowel and a wire brush, unwilling to bring in anything heavier until she understood what she was uncovering. She worked slowly on her knees, brushing ash and burned root away from each riser before moving to the next, and the work itself seemed to demand a kind of care she hadn't expected to feel over a pile of old stone. By the 2nd day she had counted 15 steps. On the 3rd day she found the iron fitting, a corroded bracket set into the vertical face of one riser, the base of what had once held a handrail. Not a rough post hammered into the earth, but a fitting sunk into the stone itself, built for people who used these stairs often enough to need both hands free. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. You didn't sink iron into stone for a staircase nobody used. She counted 22 steps in total before the staircase ended at a wall, not a doorway, not a frame. A course of limestone laid tighter than the surrounding hillside, sealed with old lime mortar that had held for decades. Sean thought it was probably an old root cellar someone had capped off, and Margaret thought that was likely too, until she sat on the bottom step with her back against the wall and noticed one side of her body felt colder than the other. She sat very still and let herself feel it again, to be sure she hadn't imagined it. She held a match close to the mortar line. The flame bent inward, drawn toward something on the other side. She moved along the wall and tried it again, and again the flame pulled toward the stone. She pressed her palm flat against it, and felt cold that had nothing to do with October air. The deep, differential cold of two very different temperatures, pressing against a single thin wall. A thermometer against the stone read 14 degrees. In the open air above, it read 32. She climbed back up the stairs and checked it twice more, just to be certain the number was real. She spent the next morning working a length of wire into the mortar gaps, not trying to break through, only trying to map what lay behind. The wire slid past the wall after a few inches and kept going, further than she expected, further than felt possible for a root cellar. She worked it sideways for 6 feet before finding the far edge of the opening. Whatever sat behind that wall was not a cellar. It was something with room in it. 2 days later, she walked the hillside above the sealed entrance and found the first pipe 70 feet uphill, a length of clay piping choked with roots, emerging from the ground at a slight angle, nearly swallowed by decades of growth. Cold air moved through it steadily enough to feel against her wrist. She found a second pipe 20 feet further up, aligned with the first, along what looked like a deliberate drainage grade. The two of them set with a precision that couldn't have been accidental. Someone had built a ventilation system into this hill, drawing cold air down from the high ground and pushing it out below. The gap between the two elevations was enough to drive the draft on its own. No engine, no electricity, just the shape of the land doing exactly what it had been built to do, still doing it 60 years after anyone had asked it to. She called Michael Nolan, 74, who had worked stone through the county for most of his life before his knees gave out. He examined the wall for the better part of an hour, running his hands over the mortar, stepping back, looking again, and told her the middle section, roughly 6 feet wide, had been built later than the rest. The mortar wrong, the coursing mismatched. Someone had opened this wall once and sealed it again afterward, probably after some kind of collapse, he said. He said the surrounding stone was sound enough to remove the later fill without much risk, if they went slow and set each piece aside instead of breaking it. They took the middle section out in an afternoon, working in silence for most of it, each stone lowered carefully to the grass. What opened behind it was not a cellar. It was a corridor, 5 feet wide, well over 6 feet tall, stone on both sides, running back into the dark, the floor sloping gently downhill toward a drainage channel cut along one edge. Margaret stood at the opening for a moment before she made herself step through. She went in with a torch. The corridor ran nearly 60 feet before opening into a wider chamber, lined with stone shelving on 3 walls, wooden dividers still partly intact between the tiers. The temperature inside sat at 14 degrees on an afternoon that read 34 outside, a difference of 20 degrees, sustained by nothing but the shape of the hill and the intelligence of whoever had carved it that way. She stood in the middle of the chamber and turned in a slow circle, the torchlight sliding over stone that had not been touched by daylight in decades. Rusted hooks were set into the walls at intervals. Fragments of crockery lay scattered across the floor, pale against the dark stone. In one corner, the collapsed remains of wooden crates had rotted down to splinters, soft and gray. And on the stone facing of 5 separate shelf sections, someone had cut single letters with a chisel, the mark still sharp under her fingers. D-C-K-O-R. Margaret sat with those letters a long time before she understood She drove to the county records office and asked for the old plat maps of the townland, and spread them across a table under fluorescent light. The neighboring holdings from the 1930s were listed by family name: Doyle, Culligan, Kinsella, O'Brien, Ryan, 5 families, 5 letters, 5 sections of shelving, each carved by hand into the stone of a chamber. None of them could have built alone. She found a reference in a 1934 agricultural circular to a cooperative cold store maintained by 5 townland families. A single line with no further detail, and she read it 3 times as if more words might appear. And in a folder of her aunt's farm papers, a receipt dated 1958, stone and lime hauling, cellar entrance, 12 shillings, signed by Margaret's own grandfather. He had helped seal it. She sat with the receipt in her hands for a long while before she could bring herself to put it down. She found Nora Kinsella, 86, who remembered what her mother had called the cold room, remembered being sent up with baskets after the apple harvest, the smell of it, mineral and faintly sweet, a smell she hadn't thought of in 60 years until Margaret described the chamber to her. She said it stopped being used around the time she turned 10, and she'd always assumed it had simply fallen in, and nobody had ever told her different. Margaret brought 4 descendants of those families to the entrance on a bright Saturday, and they stood in the corridor with torches, looking at letters their grandparents had carved into stone before any of them were born. Nobody said very much. One woman stood in front of the letter for her family's name for a long time without moving, and when she finally spoke, her voice was not quite steady. Margaret didn't turn it into an attraction. She didn't file for a heritage listing. She repaired the entrance framing, cleared the drainage channel, replaced the rotted dividers, freed the ventilation pipes from 60 years of root growth, and that winter she stored her own potato crop on the shelves her grandfather had helped close off. They kept firmer through December than anything she'd ever managed in the byre, and she found herself going down more often than she needed to, just to stand in the cold and quiet of it. Her grandfather hadn't sealed that room to hide anything. He'd sealed it because part of the roof had failed, and because by 1958 the reasons to keep using it were already disappearing. Electricity arriving on the road, refrigeration coming within reach, 5 families who had once pooled their labor moving on toward things that asked less of them. Nothing about the chamber had been forgotten on purpose. It had simply outlived the need for it, and the gorse had grown up over the steps. And 1 generation later, nobody left standing on that hillside remembered where they went. Margaret stood at the top of the stairs one evening in late October, looking down at the entrance she had rebuilt with her own hands. The hillside looked like any hillside now. If you didn't know the steps were there, you would never know the steps were there. She hadn't gone looking for a sealed room or 5 carved initials or a wall that breathed cold air into the heat of a summer afternoon. She had gone looking for 4 acres of grazing ground. The fire had given her that, and then, underneath the ash, it had given her something that had been waiting in the hillside since before she was born, waiting only for someone to clear away what had grown over it. The stone hadn't moved, the letters hadn't moved. Only the people who once knew where the steps led had gone, and now, at least for a while longer, one of them had found her way back.